Okay, so now I wanted to do a new video. There's something that was on my mind that I had watched some interesting videos about the whole criticism of the 70s, the 70s and 80s generation, maybe even the 90s generation, even 2000 further on, but the criticism of these generations by the 60s generation. So I just want to, get at what's really going on, the real analysis of the 60s generation. In other words, those who were probably, I don't know when they were born, but they grew up in the 60s, and then you had my generation, the 70s and 80s generation, and I've got the backdrop of my own hippie piano, so you know that when I say something about the 60s generation and the hippie generation, that I know it from personal experience, from within my own family experience. So my analysis is not only based on my own experiences, but also my observation and looking at my own generation as well as looking at the big picture. So what are the key differences between the 60s generation versus the 70s and 80s generation, maybe even 90s as well? There seems to be this general criticism of our generation as though we have all these issues, we're not motivated, we're this, that, and the other. But I want to get at what the facts really are. So that's why I wanted to make this video. It's not purely to say that our generation is better than the 60s generation or that it's worse, or even to bash the 60s generation, but it is to point out some salient distinctions that I think that probably some people have noted some of them, but I don't know if anyone has really pointed out all of them and just laid them out side by side so we can really look at them and see them for what they really are, and maybe make whatever corrections. I mean, it's probably too late for the 60s generation to make any corrections on themselves. And you'll see why in a minute, because with my analysis, they're incapable of looking at themselves clearly and objectively and correcting themselves. And it's too late. Their time has passed. They missed the boat, most of them. Some of them did, some of them didn't, but the time has passed. So, but for the 80s and 90s generation, those of us who are entering into our 30s and 40s, it's our time now. So we're going to take the reins, whether these 60s people keep running their mouth or not. And so it's time. They're going to listen to us, and I'm going to tell you exactly, what you can do to take the reins from these old goats and make the kind of society that we want to live in rather than the one that's made in their own narcissistic image. So let's start at the beginning. One of the main problems with the 60s generation, or the main distinctions between the 60s generation and the 80s, 90s generation, and I don't know which letter is which, X, Y, Z, baby boomer, I don't care about all that. My main point is, you know what I'm talking about as far as the generation, so I'm not going to get into all that X, Y, Z crap. So what we have is the main problem with the main characteristic of the 60s generation was extreme individualism. And one of the main kind of characteristics of the 80s, 90s generation, almost as a reaction or response to that, is extreme collectivism. So this is a very important point. It may have some, other aspects to it given the, communist kind of ideology influences of the 60s, which maybe that's on the, head of the 60s generation as well. Thank you very much. But let's go further. What does that mean? What do I mean when I say that the 60s generation was a generation of extreme individualism? What I mean is that they were interested in self-promotion more than anything else. You could call it one-upmanship. Anyone, if you look closely, if you're in my generation, they might not see it themselves, but if you're in my generation, 80s and 90s, and you grew up in a 60s generation family, you'll see this. You'll see this again and again. They'll be talking, and everybody's always trying to promote themselves and one up everyone else. So it's not uncommon. Now, my generation kind of goes the other way. We kind of got into the problem of, rather than self-promotion, bringing other people down. And instead of getting into one-upmanship, we got into shaming other people. So it's very interesting, the emphasis, the distinction between the two. But we can go further and say that what the 60s generation was doing, their whole thing was nonconformity or self-expression for its own sake, regardless of any other principles, whether they were, religious, philosophical, social, whatever. They didn't care about anything, tradition. They didn't care about any of it. They put nonconformity or self-expression for its own sake, not to any purpose, not towards according to any principles, not according to any tradition, to any kind of, even a rational process. You see, so whereas what my generation has suffered from is this desire for or movement towards conformity for its own sake. In other words, we want to be part of a group because we never really had the kind of family structure that we should have had or could have had. We didn't have the community structure that we could have had or should have had. And that's entirely the fault of the 60s generation. So we seek conformity for its own sake precisely because the 60s generation sought nonconformity or self-expression for its own sake, not to any purpose. Okay? There's something else that someone had pointed out, which I had observed, and I've seen it over and over again. I'd started to formulate this notion that the problem with the 60s generation is this idealization of youth. They want to be perpetually young, perpetually youthful, like I'm going to be young forever. And it's this totally delusional kind of thing that has no basis in reality. They have no perspective, from the Buddhist perspective or the Jain perspective, both of which say that, hey, old age, sickness, and death hits everybody. So, they didn't have this. They make the pretense of it. Oh, yeah, we saw the 60s and the spiritual stuff and the Buddhist stuff, and yeah, we got into that. But they don't really understand it because they're not living it. And I would say that the difference between the 60s generation, their desire to be perpetually young, and my generation, the 80s and 90s, is that because, 70s and 80s generation, the reason, what happened, because we didn't have the kind of parental structures and family structures and community structures that we needed, we became old before we were young. And many people have observed this. This is a fact. Because we were basically having to essentially be something like parents for grown-up children, is really what it comes down to psychologically. They may have been paying the bills, but they weren't taking care of our emotional needs, which they readily could have done with all their, so-called psychotherapeutic and psychological knowledge. If they had just used what they claimed to have known, then we wouldn't have got to where we are now. But I think that the key characteristic of the 60s generation is selfishness, being self-centered, excessive narcissism, seeking attention always. Excessive attention seeking, I think, is the best way to characterize the 60s generation. Pretty much just go and watch. If you're in the 70s, 80s generation, you're trying to understand these 60s generation people. Just watch them closely and observe how they interact, and you'll notice that there's this excessive attention seeking, this excessive narcissism, and as I said, they're always trying to promote themselves and one up everyone else. Whereas with my generation, the 70s, 80s generation, what we want is family. What we want is community. What we want is belonging. And some of the things that come with that are we're seeking anonymity and maybe unanimity. I don't know if I got the right word, but this sense of that we want to be harmonious with others and not be trying to, we did get into the mistakes of bringing others down and shaming them, but not because we wanted to promote ourselves, but because we didn't like what we saw in the 60s generation. It was more of a reaction. So, and there's a sense in the 70s, 80s generation of not wanting to stand out, wanting to be part of a group. So, I don't know if I've, delved into each of these points deeply, but just to say that there's some fundamental distinctions between the 60s generation and the ones subsequent. And you guys made a lot of mistakes. And so if you criticize, for instance, the Occupy movement, and you say, well, they're just sitting around, they're not really protesting. You know why? Because they don't want to run their mouth. They want to run their mind. And they want to create a new society. They don't want to promote themselves individually like you guys did, or their own particular group or interests. They want something that works for everyone. So they are much more egalitarian than you guys could ever possibly be. You claim to be, but it's all a lie. You are all selfish. So my personal experiences and perspectives come directly from all this analysis, comes from thinking about it for sure, but my experiences in a 60s generation family and observing it as kind of like a, insider outsider, kind of like a sociologist almost, just like when I was a white kid growing up in a black neighborhood and I got to be an insider outsider and observe that experience, that reality, kind of like a sociologist. And so I see it very clearly. I see it for what it is. I see the shortcomings of the 60s generation as well as the shortcomings of my own generation. But I can see clear, it's interesting that the 60s generation blames the 50s generation, but they can't really blame them. How can you blame a generation that gives you a stable family and a stable home? And then you want to go rebel against that. To me, that's kind of stupid. So if you don't understand why we in the 70s, 80s generation want stability and security, and we want just to have a family and a community, and this is why, because you guys didn't fulfill your obligations, your duties, your responsibilities to us. And this is not really a message to the 60s generation. It's to the 70s and 80s generation, because it's our time. We're in our 30s, we're in our 40s, we're taking the reins, regardless of whether these old farts sit down or not, regardless of whether they're too delusional to think that they're going to be young forever or not. It's our time. And all of your intuitions are correct. They messed up royally. The best thing they could do is apologize to us and give us the love and support that they never gave us. Give us not the childhood they didn't give us, but allow us to grow into our own autonomy without their BS. Because their perspective is to paint the whole world in their own individualistic image. Our perspective is to create community, collaborative communities that can work together and not be based on extreme individuality or the other extreme of extreme collectivism. And that's what we need to do. We need to create what we could have had. We could have had that. We could have had that if the 60s generation was not such an immature generation. So we're in a better position than they were. We're much more mature, and we can do things that they couldn't do, that they could talk, but they can't walk. We can walk what the 60s generation could only talk. So run your mind, don't run your mouth. Thanks. Bye.